Included with the training is a set of objects in a folder called sub-object sequence. There's 7 total objects, and you can add them to your particle object directory, and we're going to be using them to take a look at different child object effects within particles. And these are all of just the individual objects, and I've just set them up with the Roy G. Biv color wavelength just to distinguish them from each other. Each object is 20 centimeters, and they each have their own material that is named in relation to their object name. So I'm going to start with a new scene, and we're going to use an object. We're going to add an object in to emit particles from, and I'm just going to add a sphere in for that purpose. Scale it down a little bit, kind of stretch it out on the x-axis. And then lift it up a bit. I'm also going to scale it down on the y and then add a tiny bit of rotation. So we can edit the material, and we're going to go ahead and call this particle base, just to make sure it has a separate material than the default, which is also applied to the ground plane and other objects that are created within the scene. So I'm also going to just change the color of the object to a gray. And then we can add the ecosystem particles. I'm just going to add that layer. Now, when we turn on particle motion, I do want to note that in the material, the disable indirect lighting is turned on. So if you have a terrain and you're adding particle objects or using, say, trees as particles, it's going to remove indirect lighting from the lighting of the terrain. That setting does not actually affect the particles. That is independent per material for the objects. So you can disable that setting because it's not going to have any effect on the render of the particles. But it will make things stand out and look a little different than they normally would within the scene lighting. So we're going to start by adding in our first object. So I'm going to select from that list. It looks like the preview for yellow was not properly created. That's okay. I'm going to start with a red object for the first. I want to turn off the fast population mode. And now we have just these objects flowing off the sphere. Now at the moment, when they come to the ground, they're just going to pass through it, provided that you have, or you don't have the clipping turned on in the options. In display options, there's a ability to clip objects under the first horizontal plane. I've got that checked off, so I can see objects that go under it. So if we want to enable collisions, it is set up per object. We can just select the ground, and we can just click on the little collision icon, or you can go to Object and Enable Collisions. So now when I start to scrub through, the objects will start to collide with the ground or anything that has collisions enabled. So first we're going to take a look at cloning at death. What we're going to do is first set up a life duration for this object, and we're going to set it to 1 second. So after 1 second, it is going to die. And actually, I think I'm going to change that to 0.5 seconds. because we do have quite a few particles being generated. I can decrease the density if needed, but for now it seems to be working okay. So if we double click on the object, we can get the properties for this object. And on death, we have, there's two different options. You can emit other particles upon death, which would mean you can set a specific amount of particles to be created when it dies, or you can just clone it into another object, which is what we're going to do right now. So I'm going to click that checkbox, and I'm going to load in the orange object. So now when it dies, it's going to change into the orange object and continue. If you want to have a variability, you can change the life duration. We can set it to 0.25. Now it's going to also add 0.25, so I am going to set it 0.3 and 0.2. So some of the objects will die out fairly quickly and clone. And maybe we'll go ahead and use 0.4 and 0.1 instead. That way they last a little bit longer. So this option just allows you to clone them. Now if the death occurs by different means, be it a collision, because we can also die on a collision. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that option on. And what we can do is, if we turn off, or just for the moment, increase the life duration to 3 and recompute. Now, when it collides with the ground plane, it'll convert into the next object. So what we can do is, now we have this sub-object. If we double-click on it, we can set up individual properties for the object, or we can inherit the emitter velocity, which is going to be, in this case, the R1 object. So it's just going to inherit the current velocity, and it's basically going to be like nothing has changed, because they all, at the moment, have the same settings. But I'm going to go back and change that death to 0.4. And we can turn off the die on collision. And now it's based on the life duration. So next we're going to set up on the O2 object to die on collision. So now when it hits the ground, it's going to die. And right now, since nothing is assigned to it, there's basically going to be no particles once it's dead. So what we want to do is, upon death, this time what we're going to do is we're going to emit objects. So I'm going to go ahead and load in the Y3 yellow object. And now we have a separate velocity setting. So it's going to emit at a defined speed with a variability, and then we can change the count. Right now it's set to 1.5 to 0.5, which is going to add or subtract the value, so we'll get about 2 or 1 particles per collision, and it should be basically random. And then it also has its own velocity. So if you wanted, and I'm going to go ahead and just move this object down a little bit. So I'm going to go to the O2 object and set the velocity to 3. And we can see how that changes. So they're being emitted, and then they have a new velocity, and they'll kind of spread out. The next thing I'm going to do is assign periodic emissions on the Y3, the yellow object. So if we go to the periodic emissions tab, we can load in a new object. We're going to use the green object, just kind of keeping everything in sequence. And I'm just going to stay with the defaults. So now the flow is based, it's per second. So every second it's going to generate up to 2 particles. And it should stay pretty consistent and shouldn't jump around too much. 'Cause sometimes, depending on the particle setup, sometimes you'll notice that every second it'll generate a certain amount of particles, and then there'll be a gap in between the next second where it won't generate any particles at all, and that can sometimes happen depending on the plus or minus setting, or if you're deriving it with a function because there's no variability. So the variability can be pretty nice to kind of even things out. So now I'm going to set up another variable or a sub-object for the orange object. And we're going to go to the collision tab, and upon collision we're going to emit objects. So I'm going to select the blue object. And then we can set the count, the velocity. I'm set the velocity to 2 to 1. And we're going to see those generated when they hit the ground as well. What I also want to do is I'm going to add a pyramid object. Scale it down, rotate it a bit, and just put it underneath the sphere, and then enable collisions. So now as we hit that object, it'll start to generate. And because the orange ones also die on collision, we can see the next set of particles being generated. So let's actually go ahead and I'm going to increase the velocity for the O2 object for that collision. And set it to, say, 5. And that way they kind of burst out. Now, we can also add additional objects to the list. So I'm also going to load in the indigo object, I6. We'll set that up with a velocity of 4 and a count of 3 for the max in the upper value. So now we can start to see those spreading out. Now I also want to note that if we go to the particle motion options, click edit, we do have the ability to adjust the OpenGL preview quality. Once you start working with very large particle systems, it can get a little sluggish, and I like to keep the preview on for when I scrub through the timeline. If you turn it off, then what it'll do is update basically based on render time. So once you go to render, then it'll calculate the particles. But I like to keep that option unchecked so I can kind of scrub through the timeline. But what we can do is adjust the preview quality. So if I set it to 20% and recompute, we're only going to see now 20% of the particles. So it makes it easier to work with larger particle systems. And then if we go to render, it'll calculate and show all of the particles. I do want to note, if you're going to be baking the particle system, that you do want to turn up the OpenGL quality to 100%, or it'll only bake 20%, or whatever the preview quality is. So when you go to bake an object, which you can do, first I'll go ahead and set my preview quality to 100. We can select the bake option, and then what we can do is set up the frames per second, and then the end time and start time and duration of the particles. And it does look like it was changed to 25. Normally I work with 30 frames per second, but it was modified. So I'm going to go ahead and just change that over. And now it'll grab that new time frame. And I'm just going to go ahead and bake 5 seconds. Click OK. And now it's going to compute the physics. So now we can very quickly scrub through the timeline and see up to 5 seconds. At least as far as the video quality or previews will allow. If you need to reduce the preview quality, right now I've got it on shaded billboard. You can set it up to individual displays per object. Since we have a lot of these lower objects showing, what we could do is set them to a lower quality or not display them if it's becoming sluggish. But you do want to make sure that you have the OpenGL preview quality set to 100 when you go to bake. And then when you go to save the scene, it will ask whether or not you want to save the particle data. It does take up a lot of space, so depending on how complex the particle system is, and if it's something that's going to take a really long time to rebake, or of course if you're going to be sending it render farm or do any sort of network rendering, you want to have that baked system saved with the file. But otherwise what you can do is just make sure that you don't save that information with the scene to keep the file size down. Because in this case, the baked system looks like it's about 1 gig when I look at my memory usage. I also want to take a quick look at the render types that we have available in the particle motion options. If we go to edit the material and we edit the particle motion, there are 2 different rendering options, motion blur and metablob. So metablob, go ahead and turn that on, is going to create a metablob object out of all of the particles. And now because of their scale, what it's doing is removing kind of the blob effect. So what we can do is there's a couple of settings. We can turn down the smoothness in order to make them kind of form together a little bit more. And we can also change and lower the tolerance a little, or the threshold, sorry. Tolerance you probably want to leave alone. I haven't found it very useful to change that setting. It mostly just causes artifacts. But it doesn't matter what type of object you have when you go to create the metablob, it will automatically be converted into basically a sphere. So even if you have trees, it'll take the individual parts of the trees and make them spheres. So even if you're using the view primitive objects, they're all converted to spheres, and kind of based on the relative size in order to create the metablob effect. And a nice thing is, when you have a baked system, you can change the render settings for the metablob options and kind of fine-tune it. And as you can see, the different materials will blend together, and depending on the smoothing, you can get a pretty nice transition. Probably need to increase the smoothing a little bit more on that. So one thing you can do is increase the size of the particles to fill in the area a little bit more. Or just kind of adjust the different MetaBlob settings. Now I'm going to turn off the MetaBlob and turn on the motion blur options. Now we'll probably need to recompute this for the motion blur. Yes, it doesn't look like that's going to show. So I'm going to just left click on the bake option to unbake it. And now we've got motion blur turned on. And what this is going to do is change the orientation of the object and sort of stretch it along its direction. For the moment, I'm going to change my display quality to smooth shaded. When I do that, however, it is going to remove the child particles from the preview, but we can see the red objects and how they're being stretched out. Now, this is going to depend on the orientation. So if you do want it to be more based on the direction of the actual emission, then you can remove the maximum angle in order to make it more conforming to the actual velocity. Same thing with the perpendicular and vertical settings. If we increase the blur amount, it'll basically stretch out the object more. So now we can see them being stretched out even further as they reach higher velocities. Another thing I can do is switch this over to a filled box, and then we can see the object stretching out. But of course, in this case, we don't see the particle or the sub-particle objects. And in the shaded billboard mode, they're not stretched properly, and then in the regular billboard mode, we don't see the particle blur at all. But basically, what this will do is slightly blur the object, make it a little transparent, and then stretch it out. So really depending on the blur length, you can stretch it out and create pretty interesting looking effects. It won't really have any sort of effect if you're rendering with metablobs, because it doesn't really matter how far you stretch out an object with the metablob, it's going to basically go down into a sphere no matter what. But using the motion blur can change the orientation of the objects, which can be really useful for certain collisions, and is really the only way other than using the effectors to change the rotation of objects as they fall or collide with things. So if you just want to change orientation, you can set a low blur amount but still have the motion blur settings turned on in order to change the orientation and kind of make the object sort of spin and conform to the direction. The minimum pixel amount is for when you're working with really small particles. For instance, the weather system and the rain option uses kind of a built-in setting for the that pixel amount in order to make sure that you can actually see the particle. So if we set the minimum size to 1, we're basically going to have the particle at 1 pixel no matter what size it is, or if it's much lower. And we wouldn't normally be able to see it, it will increase it to at least a pixel. So as you increase that value, you get to increase the size of the objects as well and how they're seen. It's useful for things like water and effects like that. Now there's a really important thing I need to show you. It has to involve these sub-objects, and what I'm going to do is just turn off the motion blur settings. Set this to the shaded billboard, and it has to do with the scaling. Basically the overall scaling. Right now, everything is pretty much uniform. We have the objects all their original sizes, 20 centimeters, plus the maximum size variation, and then the individual particle scales that are set up with the plus and minus 1 or 0.1. However, if I go to the Scaling and Orientation tab, and I change the overall scaling to 0.5, recompute, it's going to take the first object and the primary object, the parent particle, and decrease its size. But when we start getting into the child objects and their emissions, their size will remain the same. So the overall scaling only affects the parent objects in the population. It will not affect the child objects, but it can have an effect on the mean size and the mean density of the objects. So even though this child object is, I know, 20 centimeters, and we can see it in the preview that it is definitely twice as large as the red object, it is saying that it's 10 centimeters, and it's also reducing the density of the object, the weight of the object because of that. So modifying the overall scaling will impact the way these objects can behave in the scene because it changes their density and their weight. So if you need to change the size of everything, you'll have to go through the individual child particles and basically match their scale to the changes made with the overall scaling. And then you might have to adjust the weight as well to kind of keep things consistent. For the most part, I would suggest when you're working with these child objects that you have your scales set up ahead of time so that you don't have to use the overall scaling. Because it can have kind of a drastic impact on things. And the influence of ventilators and different effects in the scene will be pretty noticeable in some cases. Now, what I'm going to do is just set my overall scaling back to the original amount. And I also want to note that the emission object, the object with the ecosystem particle system assigned, can also be enabled for collisions. Now, because we have settings where upon collision the particle dies or generates other objects, we can see that we're colliding with the emission object and starting to emit particles that way. So that's depending on the setup you have. Sometimes that's useful and sometimes it isn't. I also just want to run through some of the other settings really quickly. If we take a look, I'm going to start with the main object, the R1 object, and I'm going to turn on the adhesion coefficient. It's set to 50 right now, so either it's 100% cohesive or not at all. And what it's going to do is make the particles kind of stick to the emitter object, and I'm going to turn off collisions on that object as well. And I may need to adjust the lifetime. I'm going to change the death to 1. So if we kind of look underneath the object a little, we'll see that the particles want to stick to the object more and kind of conform to the shape of whatever they're colliding with or being emitted from. And we can see that impact on there. Also, and we're not really going to be able to see that on this object, so we'll go ahead and pick a child object. Let's pick the orange object, or actually it might need to be a different one because we need to make sure it's colliding. So this one is dying on collision. So let's turn off the death on collision for the orange object. So it should still stay within the scene. And what I want to do is turn on the elasticity, which will allow us to make the particles bounce. And I think we're getting to a point where we've got so many other particles that it's getting difficult to see what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the collisions. And if you don't want to actually get rid of the effect, you want to keep the settings somewhat active, you can just change the count to 0. Maybe just kind of keep a note of what the count was previously if you want to still have that setup available. But now what we're going to see is that the particles will start to bounce as they collide. And they kind of bounce along outward from the objects. And you can see it colliding with the different sides of the pyramid there. It's kind of a neat effect. The option for attachment force allows you to stick the particle to the normals that it's emitting from until a certain force is reached. Right now, the only force that's really interacting with it is gravity. And only about half are really sticking. So what it's waiting for is a different force to push it off of the surface. For instance, we could use an object. I can add another sphere. And I'm going to go to the motion settings, set it to basic animation. And 2 seconds in, we will move it through and add a position keyframe. We're going to turn on collisions. And because this is the only thing that has keyframes, it's going to change our particle calculation time to only 2 seconds. And we're not really going to see what happens after that. So what I can do, sometimes what I do is I just add a sphere to the scene, put it under the ground plane, and add a keyframe for it a little later in the timeline. And then just set it not to render. And that way we can have the impact afterwards. And it looks like that may not have been enough force to knock it off the object. But we can see it is definitely colliding with the other objects. And we actually, it looks like some of them did come off. With the attachment force, what can also happen is as we move this sphere through and we start to collide, you can see a lot of those red spheres are sticking to the object, where some of the other objects are kind of staying on it. Typically, if you want to have something kind of stay stationary until it's hit by another object and fly off, the best thing to do is just increase the weight of the object and make sure it's on a flatter surface. But those are some pretty neat things you can do using different objects for collisions. And if I go back and change this particle system a little more, I'm going to turn off the upon death cloning, so that we should really just have one object in here now. I'm going to turn off attachment force and the adhesion, and set up the life duration to be longer, 8 seconds. What I'm also going to do is right click and replace by a plane, and then I'm going to reset the rotation. Now what we can also do is set up a fixed emission. So there's a button within the density to populate only once. So what it's going to do is generate the particles once, and then depending on their weight or the collisions, they'll stay there. So what I also need to do is make this object a collision object. So basically these objects are going to stick until they're hit by the sphere. And then they kind of spread out. We could also set it up to, upon collision, emit the other particle, which I don't want the other one emitting any particles. So what's also happening is once they collide, they start also to emit other objects. It doesn't always work for the emission. It appears that for the most part it needs to be somewhat of a downward force. So the sphere itself, as it's going through, is pushing the object onto the emitting surface, which is causing it to collide and then emit the other particles. So it's not going to emit as the sphere collides with the particles. It's going to emit once the particles collide with the emission surface. It does seem to be more of a sort of a gravity type impact rather than the object itself colliding with it. Even if you bake it, it doesn't quite work properly. We can see right now it's just colliding with the red spheres, but it's still not emitting anything. Even if I increase the emission amount, it doesn't quite work. What it's waiting for is this red object to collide with the emission surface, and then it'll start to emit the other objects. And then, of course, once it hits the ground, it'll also emit those other objects. So if we want to increase the density to start with, let's go ahead and give about 3,000 particles. And we can see that effect. Now, depending on the surface, sometimes the objects will kind of move around, even if you want them to be fixed. What you can do is increase their weight to make them stick a little bit more, and sometimes there's a slight adjustment of a couple of frames to kind of wait for everything to kind of level out. But it seems to work pretty well. So we can create some pretty neat effects this way. You can also use this to have particles kind of wait for emitters, or not emitters, but particle effectors or ventilators to come in contact with the surface and move around the particles.